This isn't just about a random moment or an awkward encounter. It's about how 1 second can make you see someone you've known for years in a completely different light. I'm still not sure how it all started, but I know I'll never forget how everything changed. Hey, in this story, I'm going to share something that turned my entire world upside down. Get cozy, grab a mug of tea or coffee, settle in, and stick with me until the very end. It's going to be intense, I promise. My name's Aiden, I'm 23 years old, and I'm just a regular guy from Portland, Oregon. I'm a senior at Oregon State University, majoring in ecology, though honestly, I'm still not sure what I'll do with it after graduation. I live in a dorm on campus with my best friend, Caleb. We met back in freshman year when we got randomly assigned as roommates. I thought it'd be temporary, but 3 years later, we're still sharing a room, and I can't imagine life without him. Caleb's the kind of guy who always knows how to make me laugh, even on my worst days. He's tall, with perpetually messy dark hair and a smile that's hard to look away from. But I never looked at him that way, at least not until that day. It was early October, a regular Tuesday, when the leaves around campus were starting to turn yellow, and the air smelled like damp earth and coffee from the nearby cafe. I spent the morning in lectures, trying not to doze off in my biostatistics class, then wandered around the library for a couple of hours, pretending to prep for a seminar. Caleb, as usual, was off at track practice. He ran for the university team and was often at the stadium. When I got back to the dorm around 4 in the afternoon, the room was empty. There was a note from Caleb on the desk. Went to practice, then out with the guys, back late. That was classic him. He rarely gave a heads up, but always left notes like I'd be mad if he didn't. I tossed my backpack on the chair, turned on my ancient fan that buzzed like a lawnmower, and decided this was my chance to enjoy some rare alone time. Quiet in a dorm is a luxury. Usually, someone's yelling in the hallway, slamming doors, or blasting music way too loud. But that day, everything was calm, and I felt the day's stress start to melt away. I peeled off my t-shirt, jeans, even my socks, everything hit the floor. Left in just my boxers, I flopped onto my bed and hooked my phone to the speaker, playing some chill playlist. It wasn't anything weird, I just liked feeling free when no one was around. I lay there, scrolling through my phone, laughing at memes and cat videos, thinking life was pretty close to perfect right then. About an hour passed. I was half dozing when I heard noise in the hallway. Footsteps, muffled laughter. I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just neighbors. The door was locked, and I was sure Caleb wouldn't be back until midnight. But then I heard a key slide into the lock. My first thought was, no way that's him, he's out in town. Before I could move, the handle turned, and the door swung open. Light from the hallway flooded the room, and there was Caleb, still in his track gear, backpack slung over his shoulder. He was mid-sentence, but I didn't catch the words. My heart dropped, and my face burned hotter than a stove. I scrambled for the blanket, trying to cover up, but my hands wouldn't cooperate. Caleb froze in the doorway, eyes wide, mouth slightly open like he meant to say something but couldn't. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, me, sitting on the bed in my boxers, blanket half pulled up, and him, standing there like a statue. Finally, he managed, "Hey, man, I thought you were in class." His voice sounded like he didn't believe this was real. I mumbled something incoherent, like, "You said you'd be out late, what the hell?" My voice shook with a mix of embarrassment and annoyance. Caleb stepped inside, shut the door behind him, and dropped his backpack on the floor. Practice got canceled and the guys bailed on hanging out, he explained, avoiding my eyes, though his gaze darted around the room like he was looking for something to focus on. I finally yanked the blanket up to my chin, my face still burning. "You could have texted, you know," I grumbled, trying to sound angry but coming off more whiny. He sat on his bed across from me, rubbing his neck, and said, "Yeah, sorry, didn't think you'd be, you know, chilling like that." There was a hint of a smile in his voice, like he was trying to lighten the mood. I rolled my eyes and shot back, "It's my room too, I can do what I want." Caleb nodded, but his eyes lingered on me a little longer than usual. "Fair enough, just wasn't expecting it," he said quieter, and there was something in his tone I hadn't heard before. Not teasing, not awkwardness, but something warm. We went silent. I was still hiding under the blanket, and he sat there, staring at the floor like he was figuring out what to say next. And right then, I realized this wasn't just an awkward moment. Something between us had shifted, and I wasn't sure I wanted to notice it. The silence in the room after that awkward moment was so thick you could almost touch it. I was still sitting on my bed, wrapped in my blanket like it could hide not just my body but all the embarrassment still burning on my cheeks. Caleb, across from me on his bed, was staring somewhere off to the side, like the floor under his feet had suddenly become fascinating. His fingers fidgeted with the hem of his t-shirt, and I noticed him take a couple of deep breaths, like he was about to say something but kept changing his mind at the last second. We both knew we needed to break the tension somehow, but neither of us wanted to go first. I cleared my throat, trying to find some confidence in my voice, and said, "Look, can we just pretend you didn't walk in on me like that, okay?" My tone was light, almost joking, but inside, my heart was still pounding like I'd just run a marathon. Caleb looked up, and a half-smile flashed across his face, making my chest tighten for some reason I couldn't name. "Pretend? Aiden, that's not so easy, you know," he said, his voice soft but with a strange edge I couldn't quite figure out. He leaned back, resting on his hands, and added, "I mean, you looked, well, pretty comfortable." I rolled my eyes, trying to hide how his words made my face flush again. "Comfortable? Really? That's the best you've got?" I tried to sound annoyed, but the corners of my mouth betrayed me, twitching upward. Caleb laughed, short but genuine, and the sound seemed to lift some of the weight hanging between us. Okay, not comfortable. Maybe free? Relaxed." He shrugged, but his eyes were still watching me closely, and I suddenly felt like he was seeing more than I meant to show. I adjusted the blanket, pulling it a little higher, and said, "You still could have knocked, you know. It's kind of a dorm rule." Caleb raised his hands like he was surrendering and replied, "Guilty, I admit it, but you know I never knock. It's our room, I just barge in." He paused, then added more quietly, "Didn't think I'd see something so personal." That word, personal, hit differently, and a slight shiver ran down my spine. Not because he said anything wrong, but because there was something in his look I hadn't noticed before. Something that made me wonder if this was the first time he'd looked at me like that. I decided to change the subject before my thoughts went somewhere I wasn't ready for. "So, what happened with your practice? Why'd it get cancelled?" I asked, hoping something normal would put things back on track. Caleb rubbed his neck and said, "Coach got sick, and without him, nobody wanted to bother. Then the guys in town changed their minds about hanging out, said they were tired." He smirked and added, "So I came back early to, I guess, surprise you." I snorted. "Surprise? That's what you're calling it now." We both laughed, and for a second, it felt like things were back to normal, just two friends messing with each other. But the laughter faded, and the silence came back, only now it felt different. Not awkward anymore, but waiting. I noticed Caleb glancing at me, not directly, but out of the corner of his eye, like he was afraid I'd catch him. His fingers stopped messing with his shirt, and he just sat there, leaning forward slightly, like he wanted to say something but didn't know where to start. My throat tightened, and to fill the pause I said, "Listen, I didn't mean for you to think I don't know, weird or something. Sometimes I just want to be alone, away from all the chaos." Caleb nodded, his face turning more serious. "I get it, Aiden. Really. Sometimes I want to just shut everything off and be myself too," he said, and there was so much honesty in his voice that I froze. He didn't usually talk like that, always hiding behind jokes or sarcasm. I looked at him, trying to figure out what had changed, and asked, "Do you ever feel like, I don't know, like we don't tell each other everything?" The question hung there, and I instantly regretted asking it. It was too personal, too close to something I wasn't ready to think about. Caleb didn't answer right away. He leaned a little closer, resting his elbows on his knees, and said, "Sometimes. You know, we've been living together for 3 years, but there's probably stuff I keep to myself." He paused, looking at me, and added, "What about you? Got anything you don't say?" His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, and my heart started racing again. I wanted to brush it off, make a joke, but instead I managed, "Maybe." Sometimes I just don't know how to start. We went quiet, and in that moment, I realized we were standing on the edge of something new. Not just friendship, but something more, something I was scared to even name. Caleb suddenly reached out and touched my shoulder, lightly, almost weightless, but it was enough to make me feel the warmth of his fingers through the blanket. "Hey, if you ever want to say something, I'm right here," he said, and his eyes met mine. It wasn't a promise or a hint, but there was so much warmth in his look that something inside me shifted. I nodded, holding his gaze, and said, "I know. And you too, if you need to." He smiled, not his usual wide grin, but something softer, almost shy. His hand lingered on my shoulder a little longer than it needed to, and when he pulled it away, I realized I didn't want the moment to end. We sat there for a few more minutes, just looking at each other, and I could feel something between us changing, slowly but undeniably. After Caleb took his hand off my shoulder, the room slipped back into silence, but it didn't feel as heavy anymore. I could still feel the warmth of his fingers, like it had soaked into my skin, and that sensation was messing with my head, like too much coffee first thing in the morning. We sat on our beds, a couple of feet apart, but it felt like the space between us was shrinking with every second. Caleb was looking at me, and there was something new in his eyes. Not just curiosity or friendly warmth, but something that made my heart beat unevenly. I tried to figure out what was happening, but my thoughts were tangled, like cords stuffed in an old backpack. I decided I needed to say something to keep the moment from getting too serious. "You know, if you start knocking every time now, I'll think you're scared of catching me again," I said with a slight grin, hoping to steer the conversation back to familiar ground. Caleb smiled, but it wasn't his usual big grin. It was softer, almost careful. "Maybe I will start knocking, just so you don't hide under that blanket like it's a fortress," he replied, and there was a teasing edge to his voice, but his eyes stayed serious. He leaned a little closer, resting his elbows on his knees, and added, "But honestly, I don't want you hiding. Not from me." His words hung in the air, and I felt my throat tighten. It wasn't a confession, but it sounded like he'd left a door slightly open, inviting me to peek inside. I swallowed and said, "I'm not hiding. It's just, sometimes I don't know how to be myself when someone's around." My voice was quieter than I meant, and I instantly regretted saying it out loud. But Caleb didn't laugh or brush it off. He nodded, like he understood something important, and said, "I get it. Sometimes I feel like I have to be someone else too, especially with friends or at practice. But with you, it's easier to be myself." I looked at him, trying to process what he meant. We'd always been close, but this was the first time he'd talked so openly about how he felt. I suddenly remembered a night a while back when he'd had a couple of beers and told me he hated how people expected him to always be the life of the party. I'd laughed it off then, but now his words hit differently, like he was trusting me with something he'd kept locked away for a long time. "You really think it's easier with me?" I asked, and my voice wavered, giving away how much it got to me. Caleb nodded, not breaking eye contact. "Yeah. You don't make me pretend. Even when I burst in here without warning and find you like that," he said with a small laugh, but he got serious again and added, "I mean it, Aiden. You're you and I like that." I felt warmth spread through my chest, and I didn't know what to say. I wanted to come up with something clever or funny, but instead I just mumbled, "Well, you're not so bad yourself, you know. Even when you don't knock." We both laughed, and that laughter was like a bridge, bringing us back to solid ground, but I could still feel we were teetering on the edge of something bigger. Caleb stood up suddenly and said, "All right, I'm gonna grab a shower. I feel like I'm covered in dirt from practice." He headed to his bag to get a towel but stopped halfway and looked at me. "You okay? Like after all this?" he asked, and there was real concern in his voice that made my stomach twist. I nodded, though I wasn't sure it was true. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just didn't expect you back so early," I said, trying to sound casual. Caleb smiled and said, "Good. I'm always here if you want to talk, you know." He grabbed his towel and headed to the bathroom, and I sat there, still wrapped in my blanket, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The bathroom door closed, and I heard the water start, but my mind was stuck on what he'd said. "I like that." Those words kept looping in my head like a stuck record, and I couldn't stop wondering if he meant more than just our friendship. I lay back, staring at the ceiling where an old crack reminded me how long we'd been sharing this room. My thoughts were a mess. I started remembering times when Caleb looked at me a little too long, or when his jokes felt like more than just jokes. Like a couple of months ago when we were walking back late from a party, and he threw his arm around my shoulders, saying I was the best person he knew. I'd brushed it off, thinking he was just drunk, but now that memory felt significant. I closed my eyes, trying to push those thoughts away, but they kept coming back, like waves hitting the shore. When Caleb came out of the bathroom, his hair was damp, and he was wearing a clean t-shirt and shorts. He looked so familiar but somehow different. He tossed his towel on the chair and said, "You're still hiding under that blanket? Come on, get dressed, or I'll think you're embarrassed around me now." His tone was light, but there was something warm in his eyes, and I felt my face heat up again. I got up, avoiding his gaze, and pulled on a t-shirt and jeans, feeling exposed even though I was fully clothed now. We decided to order pizza, like nothing had changed, and sat down to watch some old movie on my laptop. But as we ate and laughed at the cheesy scenes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us was different. Caleb sat closer than usual, and when our elbows brushed by accident, he didn't pull away. Neither did I. That small moment, just our elbows touching, felt bigger than the whole movie, and I realized I didn't want the night to end. The pizza was long gone, and the old movie on my laptop was still humming in the background, but I barely registered what the characters were saying. Caleb and I were sitting on my bed since his was buried under textbooks and track gear. Our shoulders were almost touching, and every time he laughed at some ridiculous scene, I could feel his warmth seeping through the thin fabric of my t-shirt. The room was lit only by the dim glow of the lamp on my desk, and in that half-light, everything felt a little unreal, like we were in a bubble where it was just the two of us. I tried to focus on the screen, but my mind kept drifting to how close he was and how I didn't want him to move away. Caleb suddenly turned to me, and his knee brushed against mine. He didn't apologize or pull back, just said, "You know, this movie's so dumb, I don't even get why we're watching it." His voice was low, a little rough, and I noticed his eyes lingered on me longer than they needed to. I shrugged, trying not to show how my heart started beating faster, and said, "Yeah, but sometimes these cheesy movies are exactly what you need after a long day." He nodded but didn't look away, and I felt the air between us grow heavier, like someone had turned off the fan and left us in this thick silence. I don't know what made me speak, but I suddenly said, "Hey, today was weird, right? I mean with you coming back and everything else." My voice sounded unsure, and I instantly wished I hadn't brought it up. But Caleb didn't laugh or brush it off. He turned to face me fully, our knees almost touching now. "Weird, but not bad," he said quietly, and there was something in his look that took my breath away. He paused, then added, "I keep thinking about what you said, about not always knowing how to be yourself. It got me thinking." I swallowed, my throat dry. "Thinking about what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Caleb leaned a little closer, and I saw his fingers tighten on the edge of the bed, like he was holding himself back. "About how I'm probably not always honest. Not with you, but with myself," he said, and his words felt like he'd been carrying them for a long time. I wanted to ask what he meant, but before I could, he went on, "Have you ever felt like you're scared to say something because it'll change everything? Even if you want it to change?" His question caught me off guard, and I felt heat rush to my face. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and said, "Yeah, sometimes. Especially with people who matter." Caleb looked at me like he was trying to read my thoughts, and I realized I couldn't look away. His face was so close I could see the shadows of his lashes on his cheeks, and it was weirdly thrilling. "You matter to me, Aiden," he said, and his voice wavered, like he was afraid I wouldn't get it. Warmth spread through my chest, and I said, "You too." More than I probably let on. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was full of something waiting to happen. Caleb slowly reached out and touched my hand where it rested on the bed. His fingers were warm, a little rough from practice, and the touch was so light I almost thought I imagined it. But he didn't pull away, just looked at me, like he was asking permission. I didn't move, scared any motion would break the moment, but my heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. Aiden, if I do something dumb right now, will you tell me to stop? He asked, and his voice mixed nervousness with something else that made me hold my breath. I shook my head and said, I don't think it'd be dumb. My voice was hoarse and I barely recognized it. Caleb smiled, a small, almost shy smile, and his fingers slowly laced with mine. It was so simple, but that touch felt like it set something inside me on fire. We sat there for a few seconds, just holding hands, and I could feel his thumb brushing my skin lightly, sending shivers through me. I looked at him, and his eyes were so open, so vulnerable, I knew he was just as scared as I was. Then he leaned closer, and I felt the warmth of his breath on my face. It wasn't rushed or sudden. He moved slowly, giving me time to back away if I wanted. But I didn't want to. I leaned forward too, and our foreheads almost touched. I don't know what I'm doing, he whispered, so quiet I barely heard him. I said, neither do I, but it feels right. And then he closed his eyes, and I felt his lips brush mine. Not a kiss, just a soft touch, like a test, like a question. I froze, but my body answered, leaning closer, and that touch grew a little surer. His hands still held mine, and I felt his fingers tighten, like he was afraid I'd vanish. It was so gentle, so careful, I could hardly breathe. We pulled back after a few seconds, and Caleb looked at me, his eyes full of questions. You okay? He asked, his voice shaky. I nodded and said, more than okay. You? He smiled, and it was the most genuine smile I'd ever seen from him. Yeah. Way better than I expected, he said. We sat there for a while longer, still holding hands, and I felt his warmth becoming part of me. The movie had ended, but we didn't start another one. Instead, we just talked, about little things like how tired we were of classes, but it wasn't just talk. Every glance, every accidental brush of our shoulders felt significant, like we were building something new, step by step. I didn't know what came next, but in that moment, I didn't care. All I wanted was to stay here with him and not worry about what anyone else would think. The next morning came too fast, and sunlight slipped through the gaps in the blinds, painting stripes across the floor of our room. I lay in my bed, still feeling the warmth of last night, like it had wrapped around me better than any blanket. Caleb was asleep on his bed, his breathing steady, one arm dangling off the mattress, almost touching the floor. I watched him for a couple of minutes, trying to wrap my head around the fact that everything that happened yesterday wasn't a dream. His words, his touch, that moment when our eyes said more than we could out loud, it was all real, and the thought made my heart race faster than I wanted. I got up quietly, careful not to creak the floorboards, and went to the bathroom to splash water on my face. The cold water snapped me out of my haze a little, but my thoughts kept circling back to Caleb. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, trying to figure out what to do next. We'd crossed some kind of line, but neither of us had said what it meant. Was it just a moment caught up in emotions, or the start of something bigger? I didn't know, and that uncertainty scared me as much as it thrilled me. When I came back to the room, Caleb was awake. He was sitting on his bed, rubbing his eyes, his hair sticking out in every direction like it always did in the morning. Morning, he said, his voice rough from sleep but warm in a way that made me smile. Morning, I said back, sitting on my bed across from him. We looked at each other, and for a second I thought he might be thinking about yesterday too, but neither of us dared to bring it up first. Instead I said, you were snoring last night. I thought the walls were gonna shake. It was a lie, but I needed something to break the silence. Caleb laughed and tossed a pillow at me. Liar, I don't snore. You're probably the one talking to yourself in your sleep, he said, his eyes sparkling like he was glad we could still joke like always. But I noticed he was watching me a little closer than usual, and it made my heart pick up again. Fine, maybe not snoring, but you were definitely taking up the whole bed, I said, nodding at his tangled sheets. He shrugged and said, You know me, I like my space. But you look like you didn't sleep at all, judging by those eyes. I rolled my eyes, but his words reminded me of how long I'd lain awake, replaying every second of our conversation in my head. I wanted to ask what he thought about what happened, but instead I said, Maybe I was just thinking about how you stole the last slice of pizza. Caleb grinned and said, "Hey, that was a fair win. You were too busy staring at the movie." We both laughed, but the laughter faded quicker than usual, and I knew we were both dodging the real topic. Caleb got up and stretched, his t-shirt lifting just enough for me to catch a glimpse of the skin above his shorts. I looked away fast, hoping he didn't notice, but then he walked over and sat next to me on my bed. "Aiden, can I say something?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. I nodded, my throat tightening with nerves. He looked at me, and his eyes were so serious I forgot how to breathe. "I keep thinking about last night. And I don't want you to think it was just a random thing, like I was tired or whatever," he said, every word sounding like he'd been choosing them carefully. I swallowed and said, "I've been thinking about it too. I don't want it to be just a moment either." My voice shook, but I didn't look away. Caleb nodded, and his hand settled over mine, right on top of the blanket. His fingers were warm, and that touch felt familiar but brand new all at once. "Good, because I don't want that either," he said, his voice almost a whisper. He leaned closer, and I felt my body lean toward him, like we were being pulled together by something magnetic. We sat there, inches apart, and I saw his eyes flicker to my lips. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. "Aiden, if I try something again now, you won't mind, right?" he asked, nervousness and hope mixing in his voice. I shook my head and said, "I won't. Not if you're okay with it too." He smiled, and that smile was so gentle it felt like something inside me melted. Caleb leaned in closer, and I closed my eyes, feeling his breath warm against my face. His lips met mine, and it wasn't like yesterday, not just a brush, but something deeper, still careful, like we were both scared of breaking the moment. His hand tightened around mine, and I leaned into him, letting myself sink into that warmth. It was so simple but so important. His closeness, his scent, his fingers laced with mine. We didn't rush, and every second felt precious, like we were uncovering something that had always been there, waiting for its time. When we pulled back, I opened my eyes and saw him looking at me with such tenderness it took my breath away. "You okay?" he asked, his voice rough, like he was trying to steady himself too. I nodded and said, You." He smiled and said, "Better than ever." We sat there a little longer, still holding hands, and I felt his warmth becoming part of me, like we were connected by something words couldn't touch. Then he stood up and said, "Wanna grab breakfast?" "My treat, as long as you don't complain about me eating too much bacon." I laughed and said, "Deal, but only if you don't steal my fries." We started getting ready, but every glance, every accidental brush of our hands as we grabbed keys and phones, reminded me that everything was different now. I didn't know what came next, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't want to run from it. I wanted to be here, with him, and see where this would take us. Caleb and I left the dorm and headed to a little diner 2 blocks from campus, where they served the best pancakes in Portland. The October air was crisp, and leaves crunched under our feet as we walked along the sidewalk, chatting about random stuff, like how our neighbor forgot to turn off the hallway light again, or how Caleb was late to practice last week. But even those normal conversations felt different. Every time our elbows brushed by accident, or when he looked at me while adjusting his hoodie, I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the weather. We both knew something had changed, but neither of us was ready to say it out loud. The diner was cozy, the smell of coffee and syrup, soft music from the speakers, a few students hunched over laptops. We grabbed a table by the window, and Caleb ordered his usual mountain of pancakes with bacon, while I got an omelet and fries. While we waited for the food, he suddenly said, "You know, I keep thinking about this morning. And last night too." His voice was calm, but I saw his fingers pause on the edge of the table, like he was worried I'd brush it off. I looked at him and said, "Me too. Honestly, I don't know how to stop thinking about it." My words hung there, and I felt my face start to burn. Caleb smiled, not his usual cocky grin, but something softer, almost vulnerable. "Good, because I don't want to stop either," he said, and his gaze was so open it made my chest tighten. Under the table, his leg brushed against mine, and he didn't pull away. I didn't either. It was a small thing, but that touch made my heart race, and I realized I wanted to be closer, not just physically, but in a way that left no walls between us. We ate, laughed about him spilling syrup on his sleeve again, and talked about weekend plans, but it was all just background. I noticed how his eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking, and how his voice got quieter when he said something meant just for me. After breakfast, we decided to walk around campus since neither of us had class until noon. We took the path by the old oak trees, and I felt his hand brush mine every so often, like he wanted to hold it but wasn't sure. At some point, I couldn't take it anymore and laced our fingers together. Caleb looked at me, and his smile was so warm I almost forgot how to breathe. "You sure?" he asked softly, and I nodded. "More than ever." We veered toward a small park near the library, where hardly anyone went. There was an old bench under a tree, and we sat down, still holding hands. The sun filtered through the leaves, and I felt its warmth mixing with Caleb's, who was sitting so close our knees touched. I want to say something," he started, his voice serious but gentle, like he was scared of breaking the moment. I turned to him and said, "Go ahead. I'm listening." He swallowed and went on, "I don't know how this all works, but I know I don't want to go back to how things were before. You make everything better." My throat tightened and I said, "You too." I never thought I could feel this way with someone. My words were simple, but they were true, and I saw his eyes light up, like he'd been waiting for them. Caleb leaned closer, and I felt his breath warm against my face. "Can I?" he asked, his voice so quiet I barely heard it. I nodded, and in that moment, everything else vanished. The park, the bench, the rustle of leaves. It was just us. His lips met mine, and it wasn't like before, not a cautious brush, but something deeper, full of a longing we'd both held back too long. I leaned into him, answering, and felt his hand settle on the back of my neck, pulling me closer. It was so natural, so right, I forgot about everything, that someone might walk by, that we were outside, what tomorrow might bring. His fingers threaded through my hair, and I felt my body respond to every move he made, like we were made for this moment. I rested my hand on his chest, feeling his heart pound as fast as mine, and it was like a bridge between us, connecting us more than words ever could. We didn't rush, but every touch was so full of feeling I could hardly breathe. His lips were warm, soft, and every time he pulled back slightly to catch his breath, I followed, not wanting to break that connection. His hand slid to my back, and I felt his fingers press gently into my jacket, like he needed to know I wasn't going anywhere. I did the same, holding him a little tighter, and felt his warmth wrap around me, like we'd become one. When we finally pulled apart, I opened my eyes and saw him looking at me with such tenderness it stole my breath. "You okay?" he asked, his voice rough, like he was trying to steady himself too. I smiled and said, "More than okay." "You?" He nodded and said, "I didn't know it could feel like this." We sat there a little longer, pressed close, and I felt his hands still resting on my back, like he wasn't ready to let go. Then we got up and walked back to the dorm, still holding hands, and I noticed him smiling at me. We talked about something small, an essay due next week, but every glance, every brush of our fingers, reminded me this wasn't just a walk. It was the start of something new, and I wanted to find out where it would lead. A week had passed since that morning in the park, and every day with Caleb felt like a piece of something new, something I hadn't known before. We were still living in our dorm room, still arguing about whose turn it was to wash dishes, still teasing each other over little things, but now every look, every accidental touch, carried something more. I caught myself smiling just watching him fiddle with the coffee maker or frown over a textbook. It was so simple but so important, and I still couldn't believe this was my life now. It was Friday evening, and we decided to stay in instead of dragging ourselves to another campus party. Rain poured outside, and the sound of drops hitting the window made everything feel cozy, like the world beyond the dorm walls didn't matter. I was sitting on my bed, scrolling through my phone, while Caleb lay on his, tossing a stress ball and humming some song I didn't recognize. His voice wasn't exactly tuneful, but listening to him was nice, like hearing the rain. I suddenly said, "You know you're singing off-key, right? If I recorded this, we'd go viral as a meme." Caleb laughed and chucked the ball at me, which I caught midair. "Hey, don't knock my talent. This is art, got it?" he said, sitting up and looking at me with that smile that always made my stomach flip. He got up and flopped onto my bed right next to me, so close our shoulders touched. "Besides, if I'm a meme, you're my accomplice," he added, his voice light but his eyes saying something more. I felt the warmth of him next to me and said, "Fine, I'll be your accomplice, but only if you stop singing." We both laughed, but the laughter faded fast, and I noticed his gaze turn more serious. He turned to me and said, "Aiden, I've been thinking about us. About how everything's changed this week." His voice was soft, almost careful, and my heart started beating faster. I set my phone down and faced him, meeting his eyes. "Me too. And honestly, I like how things are now," I said, my words simple but true. Caleb nodded and said, "Same. But sometimes I still get nervous, you know? Like I'm scared we're moving too fast." I swallowed, feeling his honesty make me vulnerable, but in a good way. I get scared sometimes too. "But then I look at you, and it all feels right," I said, my voice quieter than I expected. Caleb smiled, and his hand settled over mine on the bed. His fingers were warm, and that touch was so familiar but still made my heart skip. "You always know what to say to stop me from freaking out," he said, and there was so much tenderness in his voice I felt myself melt inside. We sat there, looking at each other, and I noticed how the lamplight caught in his eyes, making them even warmer. Caleb leaned closer, and I felt his breath brush my face. "Aiden, I want you to know, I don't regret anything," he whispered, his voice so sincere it took my breath away. I said, "Neither do I. And I want this to keep going." My words were almost a whisper, but they were everything I felt. He leaned in closer and I closed my eyes, feeling his lips find mine. It wasn't like the park or that morning in the room, not just passion or caution, but something deep, warm, full of trust. His hand slid to the back of my neck, and I felt his fingers gently thread through my hair, like he wanted to memorize every second. I leaned into him, my hand resting on his chest, feeling his heart beat in time with mine. It was so easy, so natural, like we were always meant for this, to be close, to feel each other this way. His warmth surrounded me, and I felt his hand move to my back, pulling me a little closer. I held him in return, and we sat there, almost blending into each other, letting the moment stretch out. Every time he eased back to breathe, I followed, not wanting to lose that feeling. His scent, coffee and something that was just him, filled me, and I felt everything inside me lighten, like I'd finally found a place where I could be myself. We didn't speak, but we didn't need to. Everything we needed to say was in how we held each other, in how our breaths mingled. When we finally pulled back, I opened my eyes and saw him smiling at me in a way that made me smile too. "You make me happy," he said simply, and those words were so real I felt my eyes sting. I said, "You do. And I don't want this to ever stop." He nodded and pulled me into a hug, holding me so tight I could feel his warmth even through our clothes. We sat there, pressed close, listening to the rain outside, and I knew this was our moment, our home. Then we lay back on my bed, still holding hands, and started talking about how we'd spend the weekend, how he wanted to take me to some game, how I wanted to show him my favorite bookstore downtown. They were ordinary plans, but they felt special because we were making them together. I looked at him, at how he laughed when I teased him about his bacon obsession, and realized this was happiness, not loud or flashy, but quiet, real, living in the little things. Now, my dear friends, I want to ask you something. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Would you lay it all out right away to figure out where it's going, or just soak up the moment and let it unfold? And how do you know when something's the real deal, worth holding on to? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I really want to hear what you think. This is my story, but maybe it's a little bit yours too.